So last week we looked at Mark chapter 8. It's the center and high watermark of the whole book. And Mark has been leading us on this journey. The first half has been a lot about who is Jesus. Everybody was asking, who is this Jesus? And finally we get to this moment where Jesus turns to the disciples and says, okay, so you've been following me for this long. Who do you say that I am? What about you? And Peter proclaims, you're the Christ, you're our King. Uh, while he was technically correct, clearly he didn't fully understand the depth of what Jesus meant, and what was Jesus actually coming to do. And so while we're still asking this question, who is Jesus, the whole tone of the gospel shifts at chapter 8. And now it's this dark road to the cross. We're headed to Jerusalem with laser focus. Everything starts to slow down. Where there was miracle after miracle after parable and teaching in the first half, now everything starts to slow down. He got us through several years in a couple chapters, and now he's going to take a couple chapters just for a week of Jesus's life. So we're supposed to, as a reader, just to slow down and really dive deep into, okay, now what does it mean to call Jesus my King? What is the cost of this grace that Jesus calls me into, to follow him, to take up my cross? What does it mean to give my allegiance to this kind of King? And so this is going to occupy our time for the second half of the Gospel of Mark. Some things from today's text. This is one of the times, the third time actually so far, that Jesus is predicting his death. From chapter 8 to chapter 10, he keeps stopping the disciples on the road and says, look, guys, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. I need you to know that. And they still don't get it. A couple things coming out of the text today that you might want to dig into. One, we see this again, we've said it before, but the title Jesus loves to use for himself is this title, Son of Man. Nobody else calls him that, but whenever Jesus talks about himself, that's almost always what he uses. And it's very intentional. On one hand, Son of Man just means a human being, one like a son of Adam, right? If you know the old Chronicles of Narnia books, C.S. Lewis talks about the humans that go into Narnia as sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, right? It's that kind of, you're a human being. But it's deeper than that. It actually specifically calls upon an Old Testament prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. There we see a picture of the Ancient of Days, God, sitting on his throne over the nations, and the nations are depicted as beasts coming up and attacking God's people. And all of a sudden, one like a son of man, a human being, is elevated and gets to sit at God's right hand on a throne, something that no human being should ever be able to do. And yet this Son of Man receives worship and dominion and a kingdom. It's a picture of a human being that also apparently is divine himself. Somehow this God man becomes the one who's going to rule over the nations. And Jesus, as he's headed to the cross, says, that's who I am. I am the Son of Man. I mean, if he's lying or crazy, this is the full height of pride and hubris. But if he's telling the truth, we better perk up. We better listen, because he's claiming something really remarkable about himself. So you could dig into that, read through Daniel chapter 7, and then just think about the times where Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. And then in the midst, we're seeing two stories back to back. One, James and John, two of the disciples, come with a request for Jesus. And then after that, we see blind Bartimaeus. And these two scenes are intentionally put side by side. Actually, the exact same phrase shows up in both. So that's a clue that Mark is telling us as readers. Hey, pay attention. I want you to compare and contrast these two. James and John and then Bartimaeus both ask Jesus something, and he gives the exact same response. In verse 36, he says to James and John, what do you want me to do for you? And then down in verse 51, he says to Bartimaeus, what do you want me to do for you? Same exact phrase, and that's really intentional. So we're supposed to perk up and say, oh, we should probably compare these two scenes. So looking at the request of James and John, they're asking for greatness. They're saying, Jesus, we just said you're our king, and we think you're going to go and overthrow Rome. And so when you come into your kingdom, can we be your number one and number two? I mean, I know all these other disciples are following you, but can we be like the most important? So that's their request. And then looking at the request of Bartimaeus and his life and his actions, and even what he calls Jesus. He says, Son of David, which is another kingly title going back to the Old Testament. A couple more background elements that you might want to bring up. So Jesus starts talking to James and John. This is back up in verse 38. He starts talking about this cup that he's going to drink and this baptism that he's going to be baptized with. Essentially, he's referring to his upcoming crucifixion. For cup, you might want to look up Isaiah chapter 51, verse 22. There's some other places in Jeremiah as well that you might be able to find that this image of a cup being poured out is an image of God's wrath poured out against evil and darkness in the world. And so, what does it mean that Jesus is talking about drinking a cup and being baptized? Is another, he's using it now as a symbol to talk about, maybe even think of the flood coming in Genesis 6 through 9, right? The flood is this water of cleansing and purification that's going to actually wipe out all of God's enemies. All of the wickedness in the world is about to be wiped out by this flood. And Jesus is using this image of baptism being covered by water to talk about what he's about to go do on the cross. So maybe that would definitely give you some ways to dig into this passage and into these images here. What does that mean? He says, look, it's not mine to grant who's going to sit at my left and my right. And maybe even just pay attention to that image here. Who actually does sit on his right and his left hand side when he comes into his kingdom? When he is crowned king, who is sitting there at his right and his left? There's some foreshadowing there that Mark is giving us. And then finally, Jesus actually gives another quote from Isaiah. This goes back into Isaiah chapter 53. So down where Mark 10:45, when he actually uses this phrase, I came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You're looking back at places like Isaiah 53:10 that talk about this suffering servant who's coming as a ransom for many. And Jesus is calling upon these traditions. So he's fully enmeshed in the Old Testament, right? We have images in this scene of Son of David, from the prophet Isaiah, from Daniel, from Jeremiah, all over the place. And Jesus saying all of this, the whole Old Testament has been this story pointing to me, to this moment. So think about that. And then step back, and as you're reading through the story of James and John next to blind Bartimaeus, compare and contrast those two. Maybe a question as we close to think about would be what does greatness look like in God's kingdom? James and John are asking for greatness, and then we're contrasting it with this poor beggar who's blind on the side of the road. And what does it mean to follow him? What does it mean to be a disciple? What does greatness mean in God's kingdom? All right, thanks everyone. Hope you're having a great week. I'm really looking forward to digging into this chapter with us. God bless.